They say hell has many forms, but few men in history built it with their own hands. When the Ottoman envoys entered Wallachia, they expected tribute. What they found instead was a forest of the dead, thousands of bodies, rotting under the cold wind, each impaled on a sharpened stake, swaying like human candles before the gates of Targovishta. From the banks of the Danube to the blood-soaked fields of Wallachia, the name Vlad the Impaler became both a warning and a curse. This is not the story of a monster born. It is the story of a man forged in captivity, shaped by betrayal, and unleashed upon an empire that thought it owned his soul. In the 15th century, Europe was a battlefield of faith and empire. To the east, the crescent banners of the Ottoman Turks advanced across the Balkans. To the west, the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland watched with fear and greed, and caught between them, like a lamb between two wolves, stood a small, fractured land called Wallachia. Wallachia was a borderland, a nation of mountains, forests, and shifting loyalties. Its rulers were not kings but voivodes, princes, who survived by balancing tribute and treachery. The throne was never secure. Every year, alliances changed hands, and every peace came with a price. In this furnace of betrayal, a boy was born in 1431 inches, the fortress of Sigishoara. His father, Vlad II Dracula, was a knight of the Order of the Dragon, a brotherhood sworn to defend Christendom from the Turks. The boy inherited his father's name, Vlad Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, but before he would become the terror of empires, he was just another pawn on the chessboard of kings. When the Ottomans demanded loyalty, they demanded it in blood. To guarantee peace, Vlad's father was forced to send two of his sons, Vlad and his younger brother Radu, as hostages to the Sultan's court. It was there, within the walls of Adrianople, that the boy first learned the language of fear. The Ottoman court was a place of discipline, devotion, and silent cruelty. Vlad and Radu were not prisoners in chains, but they were prisoners all the same. They were dressed in silk, taught the art of war, and forced to bow to the empire that held their father's life in its hands. Here, Vlad witnessed power without mercy. He saw men executed for defiance, children whipped for hesitation, and cities erased for rebellion. He studied the Turks closely, their discipline, their hierarchy, their rituals of punishment. Every lesson was burned into his mind like an iron brand. But where his brother Radu found favor, Vlad found resentment. Radu adapted. He smiled, learned the Sultan's tongue, and became a favorite of the court. Vlad, however, refused to bend. His defiance earned him the Sultan's wrath and the lash of his guards. He was beaten, humiliated, and made to kneel before his captors. Yet beneath every scar, his hatred grew stronger. Night after night, the boy stared through the narrow windows of his chamber, watching the torches of the palace flicker against the darkness. He dreamed of the mountains of his homeland and of one day returning not as a hostage, but as a storm. When word reached him that his father had been betrayed and murdered by the Hungarian king's allies, the last trace of innocence in him died. In his heart, something cracked open, something ancient and cold. He learned what empire meant: submission, betrayal, and pain. And from that understanding, he began to craft his own meaning of justice. Vlad returned to Wallachia not as the obedient son of a vassal, but as a boy hardened in the crucible of captivity. The forests and fortresses of his homeland welcomed him, but the political landscape had shifted. Enemies of his father had claimed the throne. Allies were dead or scattered. The young prince understood immediately. Power would not be given. It would be seized. Wallachia was a land of divided loyalties. Nobles, called boyars, had their own ambitions, often siding with whichever empire offered the greater reward. They had supported his father, betrayed him, and now they looked upon Vlad with wary suspicion. It was a dangerous environment, but one the prince had been preparing for. In the dungeons of Adrianople, Vlad's mind had sharpened like the steel of his sword. Every insult suffered in captivity, every lash endured, every humiliation endured, had taught him the nature of control. He understood fear, respect, and the weight of authority. When he moved to claim his father's seat, he did so not with diplomacy, but with swift and terrifying measures. Power required sacrifice, even of those closest to him. Vlad's younger brother, Radu, had thrived in the Ottoman court. He was favored, cultured, and compliant, the opposite of Vlad's fiery, uncompromising nature. Radu now appeared to claim a piece of the throne. Vlad saw the betrayal in this ambition and recognized a lesson in loyalty. Blood alone was not enough. In a decisive and shocking move, Vlad turned against his brother. Radu was forced into exile, his loyalty forever questioned. It was not cruelty for its own sake, it was a statement to Wallachia and its restless nobles. Betrayal would not be tolerated, and authority would be absolute. Through these early actions, Vlad established a principle that would define his reign. Power must be respected, and fear was the most efficient teacher. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire expected him to return as their obedient vassal. Letters of tribute, messages of submission, and envoys bearing commands awaited his compliance. Vlad, however, refused to bend. He would pay homage to no one who threatened the integrity of his homeland. The defiance of the Sultan was not mere rebellion. It was a calculated move designed to project strength, independence, and the promise of ruthless retaliation. Vlad's rise to power was sealed not only by political cunning but by a personal oath. He vowed to punish all those who had wronged Wallachia, from traitorous boyars to foreign invaders. This was more than vengeance. It was a calculated strategy to establish control and instill a sense of absolute authority. Every act of violence was a message. Betrayal carried consequences beyond imagination. The forests of Wallachia, once silent witnesses to life and death, became stages for this new rule. Captured soldiers, spies, and nobles faced public punishments that were as horrifying as they were symbolic. Vlad's methods were brutal, often leaving no survivors to carry tales of mercy. Yet it worked. Fear became a tool, obedience a necessity, and the Sultan's envoys now approached the borders with genuine dread. By the end of this period, Vlad had transformed from a boy scarred by captivity into a ruler feared by his people and hated by his enemies. The boy who had once trembled under the shadow of the Sultan's palace now commanded an empire with terror as his language. This was the price of selection. Only the ruthless survived, only the cunning could endure, and only the terrifying could rule. Vlad's rise to power was sealed not only by political cunning but by a personal oath. He vowed to punish all those who had wronged Wallachia, from traitorous boyars to foreign invaders. This was more than vengeance. It was a calculated strategy to establish control and instill a sense of absolute authority. Every act of violence was a message. Betrayal carried consequences beyond imagination. The forests of Wallachia, once silent witnesses to life and death, became stages for this new rule. Captured soldiers, spies, and nobles faced public punishments that were as horrifying as they were symbolic. Vlad's methods were brutal, often leaving no survivors to carry tales of mercy. Yet it worked. Fear became a tool, obedience a necessity, and the Sultan's envoys now approached the borders with genuine dread. By the end of this period, Vlad had transformed from a boy scarred by captivity into a ruler feared by his people and hated by his enemies. The boy who had once trembled under the shadow of the Sultan's palace now commanded an empire with terror as his language. This was the price of selection. Only the ruthless survived, only the cunning could endure, and only the terrifying could rule. The year was 1462. The Ottomans advanced once again, expecting a swift campaign. They believed Wallachia would crumble like dust beneath their armies. Instead, they marched into silence, a silence broken only by the whisper of carrion birds. As the Turkish soldiers crossed the Danube, the air thickened with the stench of decay. Before them stood a sight so grotesque that even the hardened veterans of the Sultan's army recoiled in disbelief. Tens of thousands of bodies impaled on sharpened stakes stretched across the plain near Targovishta. Men, women, soldiers, and prisoners alike were lifted into the air, their forms swaying in the wind like macabre sentinels guarding the land. Contemporary German pamphlets describe it as der Wald der Pfähle, the forest of the stakes. Ottoman chroniclers called it Kazukli Orman, the forest of the impaled. It was not rumour. It was spectacle, a calculated message carved into human flesh. When Sultan Mehmed II himself arrived and beheld the horror, even he, conqueror of Constantinople, turned away in disgust. The Sultan, who had seen empires fall and cities burned, declared, "It is not possible to deprive of his country a man who does such things." The message had been received. Vlad had built a wall not of stone, but of corpses. To outsiders, it was barbarism. To Vlad, it was strategy. He understood that Wallachia could never defeat the Ottoman Empire through numbers or strength, but terror could level the field. Every stake was chosen, every victim placed with precision. Ottoman soldiers found their comrades displayed in perfect rows, their faces frozen in eternal agony. Villages that had surrendered to the Sultan's forces were left untouched, while those that resisted were erased from the map. It was psychological warfare at a scale unseen in medieval Europe. German merchants and travellers who witnessed the aftermath carried the stories back west. Their printed pamphlets spread faster than armies, describing Vlad as the devil in human form. The Impaler prince became a legend of cruelty, but behind that legend lay a method. The gruesome display forced the Ottoman army into hesitation. Entire divisions turned back, unwilling to march through lands that seemed cursed by death itself. Yet this victory carried a hidden cost. Fear that once protected Vlad began to consume him. Every whisper of betrayal, every shadow of disobedience, now demanded punishment. He believed terror had saved Wallachia, and so it became his only language of rule. In protecting his land from invasion, he began to lose the humanity that once bound him to it. In the chronicles of Europe, Vlad became both monster and martyr. To the Christian kingdoms that feared the Ottomans, he was a defender of the faith, a brutal saviour who held the Turks at bay. To others, he was a lunatic tyrant whose thirst for blood had no limit. But the truth, buried beneath the propaganda, is far more complex. Ottoman sources like those of Tursun Beg portray Vlad as a man shaped by empire's cruelty. He had learned its methods in captivity and returned to wield them as weapons of resistance. His atrocities mirrored those he had witnessed in the Sultan's court: executions, impalements, and public displays of terror. What the Ottomans had taught him as discipline, he returned to them as defiance. The forest of the impaled was not madness. It was message, a grim warning to all who sought to conquer a nation that refused to kneel. But the cost of that warning was immense. His people lived in silence, too afraid to speak his name. His allies distanced themselves, fearing that proximity to the impaler's wrath was a death sentence. and so the line between savior and monster blurred until it vanished entirely. Vlad had built his fortress of fear, but its walls trapped him as well. Behind every act of vengeance, behind every sharpened stake, lay the same haunting truth. He had become the reflection of the empire he despised. This was the hidden price of defiance, the transformation of a man into a legend, and of a legend into a curse. After the forest of the impaled, silence fell over Wallachia. The Ottomans had retreated, their pride wounded, their armies shaken, but the borderland still crawled with spies, deserters, and captured soldiers who now filled Vlad's prisons. For the prince, these men were not merely prisoners, they were symbols of the empire's arrogance. Deep within the stone fortresses of Targovishte, the air reeked of iron, sweat, and fear. The cells were dark, barely lit by torchlight, where the cries of the condemned echoed through narrow corridors. Here, Vlad became both ruler and executioner, not out of pleasure, but out of conviction. He believed that control over fear began with mastering the minds of those who lived within it. Each prisoner was treated differently, depending on his allegiance. Those who had betrayed Wallachia were broken publicly. Those who had fought bravely but belonged to the enemy were used as examples of Ottoman weakness. No one left the dungeons untouched by the shadow of their keeper. It was said that Vlad often walked the corridors himself, his boots striking the damp floor in slow rhythm. He would stop before a cell, stare into the eyes of the prisoner, and ask a single question: "Who do you serve?" The answer determined their fate: mercy, torment, or impalement. For many, the question itself was the torture. Vlad's cruelty was not chaos, it was order. He believed terror was the purest form of discipline. In his eyes, mercy invited rebellion, but fear created silence, and silence was safety. The dungeons became a stage of psychological warfare. Prisoners were forced to witness executions, to hear the screams of their comrades, to understand that defiance had no meaning here. Guards were instructed to speak softly, to maintain calm, even as they prepared the condemned for indifference was more terrifying than rage. Ottoman captives who once mocked the Wallachians soon prayed for death. Their letters, intercepted by Vlad's scribes, described the unimaginable men begging to be impaled sooner rather than later, unable to bear the waiting. It was this waiting, this measured cruelty, that broke their spirit before their bodies ever met the stake. Even among his own men, Vlad's control was absolute. No guard dared to disobey. No soldier questioned an order. He ruled not through faith or loyalty, but through the fear that had once ruled him. The boy who once trembled in the Sultan's palace now made others tremble in his own. Yet beneath this cold system, something began to change. The boundaries between justice and obsession blurred. Vlad no longer distinguished between enemies and those who merely disappointed him. He saw betrayal in hesitation, weakness in mercy, and danger in every unfamiliar face. His fortress of discipline was becoming a prison for his own mind. As months turned to years, the gatekeeper of Wallachia became a figure of nightmare. Foreign spies described his prisons as chambers of silence, places where hope itself was executed. Ottoman chronicles whispered of Vlad as Kazukli Bey, the lord of the stakes. In the West, he was Dracula, the dragon's son who drank the blood of his enemies. Legend had begun to eclipse truth, but behind the myth stood a man who no longer slept. Every night, Vlad paced the ramparts, watching the torches flicker beyond the walls. He trusted no one, not his soldiers, not his advisors, not even the clergy who blessed his reign. He had learned that love and loyalty were fragile currencies, easily bought, easily broken. Only fear endured. Inside the gatekeeper's cell, however, A strange reflection took hold. In the faces of his prisoners, Vlad began to see himself. He remembered the boy in Adrianople, the captive who swore he would never kneel again. Now he had become the captor. The cycle had turned. The empire he fought so fiercely against now lived within him. Its cruelty, its precision, its hunger for control. He had absorbed the very darkness he once swore to destroy. By the time the torches burned low and the screams faded into memory, the man who emerged from those dungeons was no longer fighting for Wallachia. He was fighting against his own reflection. The gatekeeper had sealed the door not just on his enemies, but on his soul. And beyond those walls, the world was already changing. The Ottomans were regrouping, the Hungarians were watching, and Vlad's legend, half hero, half monster, was beginning to spread faster than his army ever could. Long after the stakes were planted and the cells filled, Wallachia bore witness not only to Vlad's terror, but to the memory of it. Stories travelled faster than armies, carried on the tongues of merchants, travellers, and fleeing survivors. Every German pamphlet, every Ottoman report, every whispered rumour became a record of horror. Europe was fascinated and horrified in equal measure. Princes and popes alike debated the nature of Vlad's cruelty. Was he a saviour defending Christendom from the Ottoman tide, or a monster who had crossed the line from justice to madness? The answer depended on which version of history one read, and history was being rewritten in real time. In Wallachia itself, chronicles were kept secretly. Scribes recorded the deeds of their prince in hidden manuscripts, folding fear into every inked letter. Some praised him as a vigilant ruler, others condemned him as a tyrant. Yet in both, one theme remained consistent. Vlad's reign had reshaped the nation's psyche. Every village and fortress remembered the forest of the impaled and the dungeons of Targovishta. These chronicles became the foundation of what would later be called the Library of the Lost. Not a library of books, but a library of memory, lost names, forgotten faces, lives erased by vengeance and war. It was in these hidden archives that historians centuries later would seek to separate truth from legend. Propaganda spread as fast as terror. German pamphlets described Vlad as the devil incarnate, exaggerating the number of stakes, the cruelty of his methods, and the pleasure he supposedly derived from suffering. Ottoman chroniclers emphasized his ruthlessness as proof of Christian barbarity, framing Wallachia's defense as a moral lesson in tyranny. Even in the letters of merchants, diplomats, and travelers, Vlad became larger than life, half man, half myth. The line between truth and fabrication blurred. Historians, reading centuries later, struggled to piece together the reality beneath the terror. Was every story of impalement true? Had Vlad killed tens of thousands, or were the numbers inflated by fear and fascination? The forest of the impaled existed, yes, but it became a symbol as much as a historical fact, a monument to resistance, revenge, and the power of legend. Vlad himself did not care for reputation. He ruled through fear, not through flattery or diplomacy. He measured loyalty and obedience in obedience and survival, not in praise. Yet the world would forever remember him by what it wrote, spoke, and whispered, creating a legacy beyond his control. Propaganda spread as fast as terror. German pamphlets described Vlad as the devil incarnate, exaggerating the number of stakes, the cruelty of his methods, and the pleasure he supposedly derived from suffering. Ottoman chroniclers emphasized his ruthlessness as proof of Christian barbarity, framing Wallachia's defense as a moral lesson in tyranny. Even in the letters of merchants, diplomats, and travelers, Vlad became larger than life, half man, half myth. The line between truth and fabrication blurred. Historians, reading centuries later, struggled to piece together the reality beneath the terror. Was every story of impalement true? Had Vlad killed tens of thousands, or were the numbers inflated by fear and fascination? The forest of the impaled existed, yes, but it became a symbol as much as a historical fact, a monument to resistance, revenge, and the power of legend. Vlad himself did not care for reputation. He ruled through fear, not through flattery or diplomacy. He measured loyalty and obedience in obedience and survival, not in praise. Yet the world would forever remember him by what it wrote, spoke, and whispered, creating a legacy beyond his control. Within Wallachia, the Library of the Lost held a more personal record. It contained the memories of those who had served, suffered, or survived under Vlad's reign. The boy who had been broken in the Ottoman dungeons had now broken his enemies, and in the process had fractured his own people. Fear was both protection and imprisonment. Villagers whispered his name cautiously, fearing its echo might reach the prince's ears. Soldiers obeyed with precision, their loyalty forged through terror rather than respect. Even allies questioned whether survival was worth proximity to the impaler's wrath. Beyond Wallachia, the legend grew. Vlad's story traveled across empires, inspiring fear and fascination alike. Artists, writers, and chroniclers added their interpretations, each one layering horror, heroism, or myth upon the next. And slowly, the man who had once walked the forests of Wallachia became a symbol, a warning, a lesson, and a curse. The Library of the Lost preserved this duality. It recorded not only what happened, but what was remembered, exaggerated, and feared. It held the tension between history and legend, fact and fiction, life and terror. It was a place where the cost of power, the weight of vengeance, and the fragility of humanity could be read in silence between lines. In the end, Vlad III became more than a man. He became an echo through time, a cautionary tale whispered across borders, a shadow that haunted both enemies and allies. The Library of the Lost ensured that his deeds, whether horrifying, heroic, or both, would never be forgotten.